Ευχαριστώ. Καλησπέρα σε όλους. Εγώ είμαι ο Δημήτρης Τζάκσον. Θα ήθελα να σας καλωσορίσω σε αυτή τη σημερινή μας εκδήλωση, συζήτηση με τον ψυχαναλυτή και συνάδελφο John Steiner. Και αυτό επί τη ευκαιρία της έκδοσης του βιβλίου της Hanna Segal, Όνειρο, φαντασίωση και τέχνη, με μετάφραση της Δάφνης Λαρούνη. Είμαστε πολύ ευτυχείς που έχουμε τον κύριο Steiner μαζί μας σήμερα και απλώς θα σας πω πολύ λίγα λόγια για τον κύριο Steiner. Νομίζω οι περισσότεροι από εσάς τον γνωρίζετε, τον έχετε διαβάσει κλπ. Ενδεχομένως κάποιοι πιο νέοι να μην τον γνωρίζουν τόσο καλά. Ο κύριος Steiner είναι μέλος διδάσκων αναλυτής της Βρετανικής Ψυχαναλυτικής Εταιρείας και ένας από τους, θα έλεγα, από τους πιο σημαντικούς μετακλινικούς αναλυτές, μαζί με τον, θα λέγαμε, τον Ron Britton και τον Michael Feldman. Είναι γνωστός κυρίως, θα έλεγα, λόγω του πρώτου του βιβλίου για τα ψυχικά καταφύγια, τα psychic retreats. Τα ψυχικά καταφύγια είναι μια ανάπτυξη, αν θέλετε, και μια προέκταση του έργου του Rosenfeld για τον παθολογικό ναρκισσισμό. Δεν θα μπω περισσότερο στο έργο του ίδιου του κυρίου Steiner. Έχει δημοσιεύσει 3 βιβλία. Το πρώτο ήταν αυτό, για τα ψυχικά καταφύγια. Το δεύτερο ήταν για τώρα η μετάφραση είναι λίγο δύσκολη, το seeing and being seen, το να βλέπεις και να σε βλέπουν, πολύ λαϊκιστική μετάφραση, που αφορά το πώς αναδύεται, πώς βγαίνει κανείς από ένα ψυχικό καταφύγιο, μια αμυντική στάση ναρκισσιστικής φύσεως. Και το τελευταίο του βιβλίο, το Illusion, Disillusion και Irony στην ψυχανάλυση. Έχει δημοσιεύσει πολλά άρθρα και συμμετάσχει σε πολλούς συλλογικούς τόμους. Θα έλεγα ότι το έργο του είναι, αυτό που το διακρίνει είναι η διάβγεια των κλινικών παραδειγμάτων, και αυτό έχει μια ομοιότητα με τη Segal, με την έννοια ότι η θεωρία αναδεικνύει την κλινική και η κλινική αναδεικνύει τη θεωρία. Είναι σε μια συνεχή διαπλοκή. Δεν θα πω κάτι άλλο, μόνο το τελευταίο, ότι ο λόγος που τον κάλεσε τον κύριο Steiner είναι το εξής. Επειδή κάποτε μου είχε πει η Hanna Segal ότι από όλους τους αναλυτές, τους κλινικούς φυσικά, αισθανόταν ότι εκείνος ήταν πιο κοντά στη σκέψη της και μάλιστα ήταν και αναλυόμενος της. Και θεώρησα ότι ήταν ο πλέον αρμόδιος κατά κάποιο τρόπο και κατάλληλος για να συζητήσει σήμερα και να μας διαφωτίσει σχετικά με το έργο της Segal, ιδιαίτερα όσον αφορά την τέχνη. Να πω 2 σημεία μόνο πριν αλλάξουμε γλώσσα και πάμε στην αγγλική. Όπως θα έχετε δει, δυστυχώς δεν έχουμε ταυτόχρονη μετάφραση. Δεν έχουμε αυτή τη δυνατότητα. Όμως, η σημερινή συζήτηση βιντεοσκοπείται και θα αναρτηθεί στο YouTube. Οπότε, κανείς θα έχει την δυνατότητα να το κατεβάσει και να το δει όλο το πρόγραμμα, δηλαδή τη συζήτηση με την ησυχία του, ξανά ίσως ορισμένα σημεία τα οποία διέφυγαν ή δεν ήταν τόσο σαφή. Και ίσως αυτό βοηθήσει σε έναν βαθμό. Και το δεύτερο, ότι θα μπορέσετε να υποβάλλετε, αν θέλετε, κάποιες ερωτήσεις, κάποια ερώτηση στα ελληνικά, στο chat, που είναι στο πλάι, θα το ξέρετε βέβαια, και στα ελληνικά, και εγώ θα προσπαθήσω να μεταφράσω και να μεταφέρω την ερώτηση στον κύριο Steiner. Με αυτά θα περάσω το λόγο στον κύριο Steiner και θα αλλάξουμε μιλώντας πλέον στην αγγλική. John, good evening. Let me just thank you to begin with for agreeing to take part in this event, discussion, on the eve, well, not on the eve, the recent publication of a translated book of Hanna Segal's Dream, Fantasy, and Art. I just gave a brief, a very brief biographical sketch of, you know, your work and your publications. I ended by saying something which I will say to you as well, that the reason I asked you to speak and talk about Hanna Segal today is that I remember she once said to me that that the analyst that she felt was closer to her thinking was you. It always stayed with me. It's also well known that she was your analyst when you began training. But her telling me that has always stuck in my mind. So I thought you would be the most, the right person actually for us to discuss her life, her work, her legacy, and what she has passed down to us through her work to continue, those of us who, you know, follow or who are also close to her way of thinking. So having said that, I will pass the microphone, if you like, to you, where you can tell us maybe in a few words, you know, what you feel is the main aspects of her work in terms of, you know, art, culture, symbolism, creativity, and of course, socio-political issues, which are more relevant than ever today, considering the state of the world. So having said that, I sort of pass the baton to you, John.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I don't quite understand, is there an audience here, or are we just recording this? What?
No, there is an audience. There is an audience.
But yes, they don't appear on my screen, yeah.
No, I'm not sure how that...
Anyway, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. But there is, I'm talking to, how many people are here? Roughly.
Well, my screen says 4, but I don't think that's right. I think that's us. That's just us.
My screen says 4 too.
Yeah, I don't think that's right. The camera back.
Anyhow, I assume there's several people listening, is there?
Yeah, but it is being recorded and it will be on YouTube as well.
Okay. Anyhow, I'm very pleased to say some few words about Hanna Segal. She was my analyst, as you mentioned, and she's also someone whose work I greatly admire. And I'm pleased to hear that my work's considered similar to hers, but I think there are some things we did continue to disagree about. And I'll mention them perhaps later. But most of you know that Hanna Segal was Polish. She was born in Poland in 1918 to a Jewish family, but who were not religious. Her father was a lawyer and a journalist, and they moved from Poland to Geneva and then to Paris, and they eventually ended up in London in 1940. That was the beginning of the early years of the war, and Hanna Segal was able to complete her training as a doctor in Edinburgh, where there was a special scheme for Polish doctors. And then she came to London in 1945 to start, she came to London and qualified as an analyst in 1945. She was lucky to have analysis with Melanie Klein and was a great admirer of Klein. And I suppose, again, like that she worked as close to Klein as any other analyst. She was very similar to Klein in her approach. Now, when she qualified in 1945, it was a year of great ferment in the British society. First, you'll realize it was the end of the war. The war had just ended. People were enjoying the peace, and the climate in the British society was very exciting. And at that time, there was the controversial discussions in which Klein's work was criticized, but also clarified. Now, one of the important papers at that time was Klein's paper on schizoid mechanisms. And that opened up a whole new approach to the mind, where splitting and projection became a way of thinking about the mind. And that led to a great optimism about extending psychoanalysis to more difficult patients, especially psychotic patients. And Hanna Segal was the first, together with Bion and Herbert Rosenfeld, to analyze psychotic patients. I think probably nowadays we think they were a bit over-optimistic. They were so enthusiastic. They thought they could not only analyze psychotics, but actually, if not cure them, at least cure elements, make them better. I think now we're much more sanguine about how difficult psychotic patients, but they were the pioneers at the time, were full of enthusiasm. Now, I thought perhaps I would just summarize her work by just mentioning she wrote 6 books in her life. The first book was an introduction to the work of Melanie Klein. Segal did lectures on Klein at the Institute, and these were her lectures. And she illustrated Klein's ideas with her own clinical material. So it's a very clinical book. I found it quite a difficult book, but it's once you get the hang of it, it's a very informative book. Then the second book she wrote was in the Fontana Modern Masters series, just called Klein. It was a biography of Klein, together with her work, this time using Klein's material to illustrate her work. I think it's a very good book, that one.
An excellent book.
It's hard to get hold of. And the third book she wrote was The Work of Hanna Segal, which is just a collection of her papers between 1950 and 1978. Now, the fourth book was the one that Dimitris and his wife translated, Dream, Fantasy and Art. It appeared in 1991. Now, unlike the previous books, this is a new book. It wasn't a collection of papers. It was her, she rewrote her ideas for the book. And that makes it especially interesting. Then the fifth book was called Psychoanalysis, Literature and War. And this is a book that I edited. And I wrote quite a long introduction to it, which summarized some of her ideas. And of course, the three issues of literature, psychoanalysis, and war are perhaps her main interests.
Mm.
And then finally, there's a book, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, in which she includes a lot of fascinating new material. I find the most interesting idea in that book is when she discusses the Garden of Eden and how man was expelled from the Garden of Eden. And man was expelled, she says, just to live in the real world. So instead of living in a fantasy world, the punishment was to live in the real world. And one of the big achievements of Adam and Eve was to accept reality and to adapt to live in the real world. This was not the case for Satan. In Paradise Lost, when Satan was expelled from heaven, he developed a long-standing opposition to God and saw as his aim that he refused to accept reality. So those are the main, I think, the books. I thought we could just briefly then say something about her main ideas. See, one theme was the treatment of psychotic patients, the treatment of patients who violently project into the analyst. And she wrote about this several times. Then she formulated many ideas about creativity in literature and art. I think these are very impressive ideas about the artist having to cope with mental disturbance, but being able to contain it in his craft. So the artist, through his painting or his sculpture or in literature, the artist can contain the disturbance and in that way write about it.
Mm.
She even thought there was some act of reparation through the act of writing.
Mm.
Another important, perhaps the most famous of her contributions, is about symbol formation. She clarified really the difference between concrete thinking and symbolic thinking. And the famous example she gives is of the man who said, "I can't play the violin in public because it's to me like masturbation. You can't expect me to masturbate in public." So the act of playing the violin was concretely equated with masturbation rather than symbolically equated. And there are many examples. And of course, many of the problems in analysis have to do with concrete thinking and the difficulty of transforming concrete into symbolic thinking.
This was really a development of Klein's idea of projective identification, was it not? Sort of a massive projection into the object, which does away with their distinguishing characteristics.
Yes, indeed. And you see, she says if the object and the self are confused, then the symbol can't be created.
Exactly.
And that means that symbolism is very connected with mourning. because in the process of mourning, the self is extracted from the object, and symbols can then develop. We could talk about that. He also wrote quite a lot about the death instinct, I think, trying to clarify, because people were very hostile to the idea of the death instinct. And I think she felt they didn't understand quite what Freud and Klein meant by it. I think nowadays we're much more inclined to think of it as an anti-life instinct and to be connected with envy. But she wrote a lot about that. She said, for example, one way to think about it is that if we lack something, if we have a need of something, the contact with reality means that we go to satisfy that need. But in the relation to the death instinct, the idea is to annihilate the need, to get rid of the need. And she gives that example. Well, we can perhaps talk about that later. Finally, I think we should say something about the she wrote about technique, and we could talk a bit about technique. But then the other side of her was, as well as psychoanalysis and literature, she was very concerned with nuclear disarmament and with the causes of war and the prevention of war. In a way, she used to say, it's clear that I don't believe in the death instinct because I keep thinking that we could have a world without war. And then I realized everyone who's thought like that has failed because the death instinct can't be ignored. But she has written a lot about war, but she's also was an activist. She wasn't just a theoretical opponent of war. She went on marches against nuclear bomb and then against the Iraq war. And she was never a neutral person. She was always had very strong opinions. I think I found that when I was in analysis with her. She was a very strong-minded woman. So maybe, is that enough of an introduction?
Well, I think so. I think you've given us a lot to think about, especially when you mentioned the death drive and her view that it's an anti-life instinct, if you like, or drive. But and you mentioned technique, and that brought to my mind there is two things. I think there's a misconception out there that if you interpret destructiveness, that somehow this implies that the analyst becomes aggressive, that this is a dangerous intervention to make, and that it imparts a kind of pessimistic view of analysis, and if you like, of the world, that Kleinians are always talking about, the death drive and the destructive drives, which I think, and maybe you can talk a little about this, I think it's a misperception that her position, as I understood it, was not that destructiveness reigns. It's the idea of facing truth, or facing one's destructive drives as well as reparative drives, truthfully. And that being able to do that imparts a certain, I think, basically positive attitude both towards analysis and towards life. I don't think she was, I wouldn't call her a pessimistic human being. I mean, she believed in the struggle between the two, the life and death drives, yes, a never-ending struggle. But she felt, I think, that to avoid that struggle can be costly, that we pay for it otherwise. So I was wondering if you could maybe expand on that a little.
Yes. Well, I think what Melanie Klein did, and I think Hanna Segal extended, was the idea that love and hate and destructiveness and creativity are both present and they interact with each other. Indeed, I think Klein would say that you only truly reveal love after you have destroyed the object. It's only when you destroy the object in your fantasy that you then begin to feel regret and guilt and concern. And the love then becomes liberated by the hatred. So the two interact. But often there's a great resistance to knowing about hatred. We all prefer to live in a loving world, even against the evidence of all what's happening in the world. So at the moment, we have a terrible war going on, and there seems to be no possibility of extricating ourselves until the destruction has been done. So I think what Hanna Segal would say is you can't alter destructiveness. The best you can do is know about it.
Exactly.
So if you know about it, you're at least better equipped. And when you know about it, you know about your own destructiveness, because the propensity is to project it, isn't it? Especially in time of war. So in time of war, our side are good, we're not destructive, we're defensive. The other side is bad, and that's true of all these war situations. So it's quite difficult to accept one's own destructiveness. And that's why the death instinct is so difficult to accept, that we may have within us destructive hatreds that we can't do anything about except know about them.
Yeah, do you think that was partly due to Klein's writing, which she does spend a lot of time actually writing about destructiveness?
Yes.
Of course, if you read her carefully, there's a lot there about, the reparative, the wish to repair and to restore the object.
Yes.
But on first reading her, one comes away with the impression that she's obsessed with destructiveness, which I don't think is really the case if you read her closely.
Yes. Well, I don't know. Do you know about the lectures on technique that I edited recently? Klein's lectures on technique. Now, in that book, and I expand on this in my introduction, she clarifies these things. She mentions that she's become famous for discussing destructiveness. And she says she's fed up with it. And, even in supervision, sometimes all the analyst talks about is destructiveness. And she said she wrote about it because it was neglected, but now it's overstressed. So she wanted a balance. And it's the relationship between love and hate that is so important. Because hate elicits love. And of course, so I think that book helps to correct some of the impressions of Klein.
and which is really quite Freudian, I think, if you think about it. I mean, I'm not just talking about his final dual instinct theory of, Eros and Thanatos, the never-ending battle, but where he says, everything, life is about, this battle between the life and death instincts where, eventually, of course, it will all return to an inorganic state. But this idea of the battle, I was thinking it goes back even to the Dora case, at the end, where he talks about the battle with the neurosis, given in the sphere of the transference. And I think he's not really talking about a battle in the sense of aggression, but in the sense of this struggle to overcome these destructive forces. And I think for the analyst, really to overcome, the projections that have been that he has received, and the struggle he has to come to terms with in terms of his own countertransference in order to help the patient. So this idea of the battle, the struggle, I think is always there in Freud and developed in a different way, of course, in Klein. And then I think the way Segal applies it both to art and culture and socio-political.
See, I think one of the themes Hanna Segal particularly develops is that the hatred connected with the death instinct is a hatred of reality. And the reluctance to give up fantasy and live in the real world, because the psychotic hates reality and hates particularly creativity and liveliness. That's where envy is directed. And that's the epitome of the death instinct, where it's reality and creativity that is hated. While the love of life accepts that that reality has difficulties, and yet it's also something that gives pleasure and satisfaction. And so the battle is often between reality and fantasy, reality and omnipotent fantasy. I remember her often saying that the real problem in many patients and in all of us is to relinquish omnipotence. And in order to relinquish omnipotence, you have to admit how much you enjoyed omnipotent fantasies, how much excitement and pleasure they give, and then how difficult it is to give them up in favor of reality. Reality is so mundane compared with omnipotence.
That's one aspect, to give up the fantasy in order to accept reality. But I think she also stresses the idea that these attacks on reality are really in order to deny or to keep away depressive pain.
Yes, indeed. I think that's a very important point. See, the one way of dealing with pain, with mental pain and physical pain, is that you learn to live with it. You learn to get support and to tolerate pain, and not to let pain defeat you. But our instinctive reaction to pain is to get rid of it, isn't it? And even some forms of suicide are because life is so unbearable. One of the things she said was that pain comes from living. And she describes a novel by Jack London called Martin Eden. And in this novel, Martin even tries to drown himself. He tries to commit suicide by drowning. And as he's in the water, he can't stop his arms swimming. He can't stop, and he develops a hatred for his arms because he can't, they won't die.
Mm.
And he wants to be free of pain and die. But the life instinct won't lie down.
Mm.
So there's this wish to die and the wish to live.
Mm.
And the wish to die is so often to do with deadening the pain, because the pain is unbearable.
Mm. Yes. Yeah. Well, a lot of her work is centered on mourning or blocked mourning and the depressive pain, which is denied or bypassed, or and how this, affects all of us really, but in particular artists that you had mentioned earlier in their work. But I think most of us, to some extent, the dealing with depressive pain or denying it, attacking it, if you like, for a kind of painless state, which is not really painless. It turns into a persecutory state most of the time, which is not pleasant, but it has a different quality to it. Maybe the difference between what Bion calls having a pain or suffering a pain.
I wondered if would you like to perhaps say a bit about the chapters in the book you translated, about what impressed you in that book?
Yeah. Well, I think whether she's talking about art or culture or symbolism, creativity, sociocultural issues in the other book, but they have links between them. I think her main emphasis is the one you just mentioned, the ability to face truth, to face psychic truth, and reality. And it strikes me that that really is quite Freudian in a way. I mean, if we think about, the two principles of mental function, where he talks about the reality principle as being a momentous step where what was presented to the mind was no longer what was agreeable, but what was real. So, I mean, this is the central concept. Reality and truthfulness has to do with the reality principle, and being able to face that rather than our illusions rather, and that accepting that our objects have a reality that's independent of ourselves, which sounds like a straightforward idea, but in reality, actually accepting that is not an easy task. No. It could take a whole analysis to eventually get there.
But I think she also recognized that reality is very difficult to accept. That I mean, Hanna Segal was a tough person. I thought she was, one of the toughest analysts. She was often quite outspoken. Indeed, she sometimes got herself into trouble. For example, once she wrote something about Winnicott that implied that people who transgress, like who hold hands with their patients, that they're living a lie. And a whole lot of Winnicott supporters objected strenuously, and she had to appear before the ethics committee, and I had to defend her. It was a very difficult time. But she's very outspoken. But also I found she's very sympathetic. She's a very sympathetic person. In fact, in some ways, she was a bit of a softie. She had a soft heart, one could say. But she always, I think, felt that in order to be truthful, you had to have a containing atmosphere. And in her technique, she was very observant of the analytic setting. It was very important for her that the setting was stable and predictable and trustworthy. For she argued that within a stable setting, then the patient can tolerate painful truths, which wouldn't be possible in an unstable setting. And you feel that was true about Melanie Klein too. She was very able to create a stable setting. Segal's got a very good paper on technique, and in it she describes the setting at quite some length. She says the most important aspect of the setting is the attitude of the analyst, and that the setting, such as the furniture and the times of the sessions and the fee, all that are reflections of the analyst's attitude. And Klein too described the psychoanalytic attitude as so important, which we concentrate on understanding the mind of the patient. And nothing else is of importance.
Well, that's the key. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Our whole energy is directed to understanding.
Exactly, yeah.
See, in that setting, then some of the more painful truths can be accepted, both by the patient, but also by the analyst, of course. Sometimes it's the analyst who has to face some painful truths, especially of omnipotence, that the analyst may have omnipotent fantasies of curing the patient. Commonly, if the analyst projects the needy child into the patient and tries to cure him, that's a common omnipotent fantasy. And giving that up is one of the really difficult things.
To come back briefly to that episode you mentioned about what got her into trouble, and yeah, she was not always tactful in how she expressed her views, although I found her exceedingly sensitive to the human condition.
Yes.
Extremely. But if I can just put myself in her shoes for a moment, and the hand-holding, I think what she probably had in mind and said several times is that, we can't really play act with the patients. We can't promise them a return to a better childhood than the one they had, and kind of role play, if you like. That's not being truthful, actually. You can't turn back the clock and find, the parent that you wished you had and probably didn't.
Yeah.
But what we can provide, I think, is what you mentioned, is the analyst's understanding. Real understanding. And she kept emphasizing not a theoretical understanding, but one that was experiential, that actually touched the patient deeply. And sometimes that might be enough for them to go on with. So I think she felt that, playing a role was false, actually, and analysis can't be based on a false premise.
Yes, I think that Hanna Segal would go further than that. She would say, yes, what you've described, the analyst's understanding is a critical element. But if that's all you get from an analysis, then you're left with the analyst's view of the world. A further step is when you tear yourself away from the analyst and find your own understanding, which may not be the same as the analyst's.
Mm.
And that's then you have to mourn the loss of the analyst and establish an independent understanding.
Mm.
Just as I found that when I started doing analytic work myself, I copied my analyst. And it was one of these instances of identification with the aggressor, because the things about my analysis I hated, I copied.
Mm.
For example, I used to smoke in the sessions. Now, Hanna Segal was a great smoker, and she smoked in the sessions. Sometimes when I was lying at the couch, I couldn't see the ceiling because of the smoke. And I objected to this. I hated it, And then I found myself doing it myself. So I suddenly realized that's crazy, and I stopped smoking.
Mm.
The other thing she did, which I hated, was she had no gap between patients. So, most analysts have 5 or 10 minutes gap.
Mm.
As soon as the last patient left, the next patient came in.
Mm.
And I hated that, but I did it when I started seeing patients. I did the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a long time to realize I'm copying Hanna Segal, even the things I think are wrong.
Mm.
And that led me to this idea, you have to disidentify. You have to realize I will copy the things I think are good, but I will reject the things I think are bad.
Mm.
And that's what one does that is in the process of separating. And then you not only have an understanding analyst, but sometimes you have a bad analyst internally. See, one of the ideas about reparation, and I think Hanna Segal wrote a lot about reparation. It's a very important idea for her. But people talk about repairing the object to create a good object. But if you make the object more truthful, you see, you also end up having bad objects. Not all the people in the world are good.
Mm. Mm.
And that means that as a result of an analysis, some bad objects become more real. They really were bad.
Mm.
There really are persecutors in the world.
Mm.
There are Hitlers and Putins and others. So and as a result of analysis, the good get good and bad, and the bad get good and bad.
Mm.
But the badness is more recognized as well as the goodness. So truthfulness means you're truthful about bad things. You know, I think some of what Hanna Segal did were bad things, but she was able to face those things.
Mm-hmm.
So that she became a more real, a more balanced person.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a subtle but important difference, isn't it? That you're hinting at. You know, the difference between splitting between these good and, or very good and very bad objects, and accepting our ambivalence towards objects and ourselves, which is quite a different thing, actually, and helps to go forward. It's a very painful process, accepting ambivalence towards our objects, outside and within.
The main thing she always fought for was to see reality as it is, to see the good things, but also to see the bad things, to recognize one's friends, but also to recognize one's enemies. And you see that the climate of British psychoanalysis after the war followed the controversial discussions. And there was a huge enmity between different groups in the society, which meant that people like Hanna Segal spent a lot of the time defending Klein in analysis against attacks and criticisms of it. So there was a kind of warlike atmosphere. And that meant that she was a fighter. And as I said, and you described it, that sometimes this fighting got her into trouble.
Yes. I remember in supervision, she would become particularly feisty if she felt that the patient's best interests were not being, held by whatever interventions I was making at the time, but that she would really be upset over that.
Yes.
If the patient was getting shortchanged.
The analyst had to be on the side of the patient.
Yes, always, always. Very much. So if we come back to, her work on art, it was quite original, I think. And she was probably the first to, try to distinguish what makes good art good and bad art bad or ephemeral, if you like. Again, I think falling back on and reworking Klein's two positions, the schizoid paranoid and the depressive position. That struggle, which when it's successful, she felt could lead to art that was meaningful, that people could identify with and had a certain depth to it, rather than what we might call pop or ephemeral or just sort of passing fashion. And then her work, of course, on classical art and the Greek tragedies, which is very close to us here in Greece, of course, and relevant, that where she felt that the artist really has to face the death drive, the destructiveness, and yet come out of the struggle with something that represents the struggle and I think the survival of life, the life instinct, it has to sort of overcome, in a sense, the destruction, even though, and she falls back on Rilke, I think, at one point, that beauty is just the beginning of terror that we can just hardly bear. In other words, that it's at its core is the realization that everything will eventually return to an inorganic state. At its core is the death drive. And if that can be tolerated and worked through without despair, I think that's, I haven't really expressed it very well. I'm sure you can do a better job, but I think that's my understanding of her main thesis in terms of art and creativity.
John, can I say something?
No, that's... you know, the interesting thing about that is I think the end result is not always optimistic.
Mm.
Some works of art are deeply pessimistic. And I don't think she would say that the reparative elements must, as it were, outweigh the destructive ones. What I think she said was that a respect for truth was maintained. And I think she put it that the analytic frame, and the analytic frame she likened to the frame of a picture. That if you take a Picasso, for example, with all the fragmentation, somehow what the artist does is by using a frame, he uses his craft, his knowledge of the materials, you know, of the paint and of the canvas and of the technique. He uses to put a limit, to display the destructiveness within these limits, so that the observer can look at the work of art and see the destructiveness kept within the limits. It makes it lookable. And I think
I would like to just say something about that, because somebody, I can't remember who the writer was, somebody said you have a blank canvas, and the act of destruction is putting the first mark of paint on that pure canvas.
Mm.
And then you have to start the reparation of building up a picture.
Yeah, that was Adrian Stokes.
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
You see, he said that the destructiveness is when you take some paint and you make on the pure white canvas, you make a mark. And then he says the rest of the painting is to repair this damage and create something that's a mixture of the destructiveness and the reparation.
Mm.
Now, I don't think Hanna Segal thought that. I think she thought more that was the craft of the artist. That she wrote several things about art. I mean, for me, the most impressive one was William Golding's The Spire. It's about delusion and creativity. See that the character in the book was delusional. He thought he could be omnipotent and build a cathedral even though it had no foundations.
Mm.
But the artist described this and was himself trying to build a novel without proper foundations. But what he did is he put it in a frame. Right? Anyway, we could discuss that. That's a whole area of what she thought was the way reality can express destructiveness, but also make it manageable. You can observe it if it's in a painting. In fact, Freud talked about that. He distinguished, but he talked about the fire in the theatre. If there's a fire in a fireplace, in a theatre, in a play, you don't get anxious. But if the curtains of the theatre catch fire, it's dangerous. So if the frame catches fire, there's nothing to contain the destructiveness. But if it's within the frame, then we can look at it, even though terrible things, murders and all sorts of things take place. So I think that was her view as I understand it. And of course, because artists tell us about the truth, isn't it? That's what art can do.
If I'm not mistaken, there was some criticism that her work on art had to do more with classical art than modern or postmodern ideas on art, which to some extent transgress the frame, whether it's in theater or painting or sometimes even music, that there's a tendency to not quite separate viewer from what is being viewed, the observer from the observed. There's a tendency these days, I'm not an expert on art, but that when she says that the ugliness is in the content, but the beauty is in the form that it takes, or what the artist makes of it, that this refers more to classical art than contemporary. I'm not sure about that, but I think I have heard that said from certain quarters. I don't know if you've encountered it.
I don't understand all of it. I think she was interested in people like Beckett and Waiting for Godot, and the despair expressed there, but in the contents of the play, the structure of the play. You know, you can't forget your lines. You've got to learn the play, and I think it's very relevant for the psychoanalytic frame. He thought that there was a frame that had a similar meaning in analysis as it does in a painting. That within that frame, the patient is free to express all kinds of destructive things, as long as the frame remains intact. But if the frame is attacked, then analysis may break down. And then it ceases to be a work of art. Then it's just that, the curtains catch fire. And of course, that's technically a huge issue, isn't it? Because often the patients cannot accept the frame.
Well, yes, I was thinking this is a huge issue in the analysis, because I think her position was that the frame, and I think you were alluding to this, protects the patient, actually.
Yes.
Protects the patient rather than something that is sort of inflicted on him or forced upon him, which patients often feel that it's an expression of authoritarianism on the part of the analyst. But
so, yes,
yeah,
it's an issue then of dominance, of humiliation. The brain is used to keep the patient subservient. And that's, of course, has to be analyzed too.
Exactly, yeah. And there is pressure, of course, on the analyst to sort of to fudge it a bit, you know, to make allowances, you know, to allow a few transgressions. And I think she would point out, and I think clinical reality points to this, when the analyst is nudged into that sort of position of loosening the frame, if you like. And I'm not talking about an authoritarian frame. I want to emphasize that. Patients can become quite anxious, that they may have been asking for a more, what they call a humane attitude, more flexible. It's usually cast in terms of flexibility and making allowances. And sometimes that's the case, you know, if it's been thought through, it's true. But quite often when the analyst is sort of nudged into that position, patients can become quite anxious. That, whoops, you know, this sort of protective boundary is, can be penetrated, can be transgressed. And if you can do it for minor issues, maybe it could happen with much larger issues or important issues.
Yes, I mean, these are, in practice, very difficult technical problems. If the patient, for example, wants session times changed frequently, should the analysis accept these changes as the patient's justified need, or should they try and keep the setting, or should they analyze it? How do you deal with it? It's a very difficult issue. And I think that's where the attitude of the analyst is so important. If the primary aim is to understand, then all other things have to have secondary importance. But I don't think we know how to deal with it. But a good example is the whole COVID crisis, where so much of our work has been what they call remote work, isn't it? And it's been necessary. You either had nothing or you had remote work. But now you see very big problems in returning to a non-remote kind of analysis. The setting has been altered, and many analysts have great trouble with returning to and what now is a stable setting. Our own ideas have changed. Very difficult to decide how, whether to see people in person or whether to continue remotely.
Yes, I mean, it's a huge issue that's being heavily debated internationally and within the IPA as well, which I've been taking part in. There are parts of the world where, you know, analysts are pushing to conduct, you know, analysis and training analyses and all of training remotely.
Yes.
As if it doesn't really make a difference whether there's, you know, in-person presence, live presence or not.
I think Hanna Segal would have been very impatient with remote analysis.
No.
It wouldn't suit her.
No. We're talking about art and the aesthetic experience. Again, it's because as I read her, you know, I think she's very much, as was Klein, based in Freud, although this was rarely recognized.
Yes.
And
definitely the case. Though.
Yes, yeah, it's not always made explicit.
No.
But her thoughts on, you know, her work on aesthetics and the depressive position, it always, you know, reminds me of that wonderful paper of Freud's on transience.
Yes.
Where he's, you know, walking in the hills in the mountains with his two taciturn friends, as he calls them. Yeah. And he realizes that their resistance to appreciating the beauty that was around them had to do with a recognition and acceptance of the passing of all things, as he says. And this brings thoughts of death, yes, and of mourning. So, I mean, he was very well aware of that. And I think this is really, it was probably Klein who gave it a theoretical structure in her work on the depressive position, gave a theoretical underpinning to it, and then further worked through by Segal. But I think its roots can be found in Freud's thinking, not just in transience. There are other places as well, but that's one that always comes to mind.
Yes. Now, you see, Freud's interpretation of it's not certain, but people think it may have been Rilke, the poet, but it's apparently not completely certain. But Freud's interpretation was that the poet could not tolerate mourning. He could not mourn. That means that he could not see life as cyclical. He could not see that summer was followed by winter and then would be followed by spring and then summer again. See, for him, there was no return. What was dead was always dead. Now, both Hanna Segal and Melanie Klein were very conscious of loss and of mourning. In fact, one of the points Hanna Segal makes is that Hanna Segal had a sister who died. The sister, I can't remember the age, I think the sister was something like 3 years older. And she died when Hanna Segal was, again, something like 3 or 4. So she had a mourning early in her life of a very loved sister, of a kind of older protective figure. And Hanna Segal remarks, the same was true of Melanie Klein. Melanie Klein had an older sister who died. And there's something about having experience of mourning that allowed her to give a central role to mourning in her theories. I think Klein's 2 papers on mourning are 2 of the best papers she's written. They're wonderful papers about facing loss and separating from the lost object. And Hanna Segal too wrote very good papers on mourning. And it's through mourning, see, that development can proceed.
Correct me if I'm mistaken. I think that one of Klein's papers on mourning, I had read somewhere, was in a sense autobiographical and followed, I think, the death of her son in that mountaineering.
That's also disputed. I thought it was that, but some writers, but whether it is or not, there was, Klein described a Mrs. A whose son was killed. And she had a dream that she was flying with her son. And then the son fell to the earth. And at first in the dream, Mrs. A followed the son to the earth and would have died with the son. But on the way down, she pulled away. She decided life is good. And she allowed the son to die, and she stayed alive. So she turned towards life, having been propelled towards death. And it's that which is such a vivid illustration of the life instinct, allowing us to separate and allow the dead objects to die. That's in Klein, but I think Segal was very conscious of this herself. She had many losses in her life. So she was a migrant. You know, she was born in Lodz and Woods. Then they lived in Warsaw. Then they moved to Geneva. And then when she was something like 16 or 17, she persuaded her parents to let her go back to Warsaw. And then she came to London. She was a migrant. And I have a lot of sympathy because I'm also a migrant. And Klein was a migrant. You know, Klein went from Vienna to Moravia, to Budapest, to Berlin, and then to London. And all the time she was concerned whether she would be welcome, whether she would be given a haven, whether her ideas could develop. So that these mean that each time she moved, she had to mourn the loss of the previous home. And she said mourning became not just something you do when someone dies, but with every change involves mourning.
You might say that an analysis is really a process of mourning from the beginning until the end, of letting go of certain fantasies or objects or perceptions that we have of ourselves, illusions, if you like.
That's right. That's right.
So in that sense, it's a painful process.
Yes, and involves loss.
Yes. And eventually, of course, the loss of the analyst at the end of well, you might call it good analysis, a successful analysis, if there is such a thing. But yeah, I think a good analysis, you eventually have to part ways with your analyst.
Yes, but you also have to, as it were, replace the concrete analyst with a symbol. So you have an idea of what is a good analysis, rather than who is a good analyst. The elements, you know, see, when Hanna Segal talked about people analyzing like she does, see, we had different models. Particularly, we had Betty Joseph, Bion, Rosenfeld, and Segal. They were the four big figures in my education. And you had a sort of the left wing and the right wing. And the left wing was, as it were, Betty Joseph, who was insisting on staying in the here and now. And then you had Herbert and Bion, who went off into theories. But Hanna Segal, I thought, was somehow, she was a middle of the road analyst. She was very balanced. But there were these extremes, you see, that there was quite a lot of disagreements amongst colleagues. Find this between Michael Feldman and me, but he's much more in the Betty Joseph mold, and I'm much more in the Hanna Segal mold, the Herbert Rosenfeld mold. But see, the point, I think, is that out of this, we relinquish the actual analyst and we install an idea of a good analyst who has a bit of Betty Joseph and a bit of Herbert Rosenfeld, different elements. And we construct our own identity then. So you install a symbol of the analyst rather than the actual analyst. And that's, I think, requires mourning. You've got to let the actual analyst.
Which I think you were alluding to it when we started this discussion, when you talked about identifications.
Yes.
It continues past the end of the analysis, when the analysand or future analyst does gradually have to shed those identifications and find his own voice.
But it involves two processes. First, you have to be able to identify, and then you have to be able to disidentify. And that's repeatedly happens through an analysis. Sometimes people have problems in the first stage, they can't identify. Most have problems in the second, they can't disidentify.
But you're bringing into the discussion, Betty Joseph brings to my mind something we've left out, which is Hanna Segal's famous aphorism concerning the countertransference, it being, the best of servants, but the worst of masters. So I think that was an example of, her middle of the road, more balanced approach.
Yes. That was Klein too. Klein was very suspicious of the use of countertransference. She kept emphasizing that whatever feelings are produced in the analyst, they're the analyst's feelings. They're not something magically inserted in the analyst's mind. And Hanna Segal was she supported that idea.
Yes.
Because if you let the countertransference rule you, then you're not thinking for yourself.
Yes, I think it's this idea that, whatever I happen to be feeling at that moment, the patience is put into me, and then a kind of, sending that back or interpreting it right away, rather than using it. I think this is what she says, the best of servants, working it through for oneself, paying attention to it, and taking it into consideration, but working it over until, something becomes clear, rather than sending it back to the patient, which can become, I think, intrusive.
Yes. Yeah, those are real technical problems. That's still an area of active debate. How to use the countertransfer, what it means.
Yes. Well, we only have a couple of minutes to go. I mean, there's so much we could talk about. Just about the book itself, actually, which I think is, one of the most interesting books that, I had read at the time. It's been a few years. I suppose I reread it again. It's so rich. It's so rich, actually.
This meeting is about the publication of your book in Greek, isn't it? So
In Greek.
you should really say a bit about that, because I think that's a very important achievement for Greek analysis.
You know, I don't know what we could say. You know, it was a difficult undertaking. The translation was very difficult. It's always difficult translating from one language into another. And by the way, I noticed that a new translation of Freud has just come out, an English translation that at least certain sections, I haven't actually seen it, but I saw that it was being circulated. Because there have been some objections of Strachey's translation from German into English, that certain concepts were, that Freud's meaning was not quite fully conveyed in the English translation. So, you know, we have a similar problem, if you like, translating into Greek, which does not have, you know, Latin as its basis. It has different roots.
Yes.
And I have to admit, you know, we sweated for many hours over certain terms. But I hope the end result is good enough. Let me put it that way. I don't think it's perfect by any means.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure people will be very interested in it.
Mm. Yes, I think so. And especially the second book on war, literature and war, being very relevant at this time. You know, very well-known papers on silence is the real crime, and the Hiroshima wars, etc. So these are very rich sources of psychoanalytic understanding for, you know, the state of not just psychoanalysis, but the state of the world. Anyway, we have run out of time. I do want to thank you so much, John, for taking part in this discussion and sharing with us your thoughts and your reminiscences, really, because you knew her quite intimately, and I think gave us a very rich discussion, an hour and a half, which I think adds something, a backdrop to the book itself. So thank you very, very much.
Okay, I'm pleased. Congratulations on doing the book.
Okay, thanks.
Bye for now.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.